Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here so early in the morning, mainly after all the parties that have been going on yesterday. And I'm glad to welcome you here at this roundtable about the challenge of African studies worldwide. The idea was to share the floor with other associations for African studies and also to have the opportunity of discussing with colleagues what are the main challenges that are facing us nowadays. It is my pleasure to introduce you. Well, I'll start from my left side. Professor Narnia Bohler from the Human Science Research Center and the African Institute based in South Africa. Professor Paul Nugent, who was the former president from AEGIS for the past 8 years.
President for
7. 7 years, till 2015. Professor Ann Pitcher from the University of Michigan and the current president from the African Studies Association based in the US. Professor Lungisile Ntsebeza from the University of Cape Town and also from the African Studies Association in Africa. Professor Motoji Matsuda from the University of Kyoto and the African Studies Association in Japan. And Professor Lívio Sansone from the Universidade, Bahia, and the Center for African Studies in Bahia. So we are going to, my questions to the people on this roundtable are related to the place of African studies nowadays within the academia, but also within the research that is being conducted. And I do believe that we have several challenges ahead of us, and some of them are coming from what is our own background that is quite different. In Europe, just to speak about Europe, we have research centers that are based on a colonial past to start with, and that happens mainly in the 3 countries that have had that colonial past, that are based in area studies, research, that are based in development studies, and even in the global challenge that we are facing today, in particular in the relation of the need to have more social science that is following up the spread of international companies. And I think there is no better place to look at this kind of problematic as from here in Beza, that, as you have noticed by the towers that there are outside, the 2 towers outside, it is a place for some of the largest companies on pharmaceuticals, the largest European companies on pharmaceuticals. And this, of course, creates a new way of thinking what we are doing in social science and what we are doing in African studies in particular. But let me go on. African studies have, for quite a long time, been fighting to be a multidisciplinary area. And this has always been quite problematic in several aspects. One of them, for being multidisciplinary, it's not really a particular area recognized by the academia. The other one is that we need to fight for having a strong methodological and epistemological approach that will base all our research. We have a new challenge nowadays for this kind of approach. We are in a time that is dominated by the point of view from the funding agencies that we should privilege what is called STEM, so science, technology, engineer, and mathematics. We know what is the importance of these kind of disciplines, but there should also be, we should also have another point of view, the point of view from the social science, from the human science, and even an ethical point of view about the kind of research that is being conducted. And African studies, of course, they are in a particular position to discuss this kind of subjects. Another one is related to the fact that I've just mentioned about the interaction of the academia with, for instance, the entrepreneurial world. And in particular, when we speak about African studies, about the launching of the private-public partnerships that is posing a new challenge for every social science and for African studies in particular. And then we have what I think is the main job for these kind of associations as the one represented in this roundtable. That is our position as academicians to fight for a larger network, a better interaction between northern and southern institutions, and northern institutions. But I think that the biggest challenge, it's really to approach what are northern and southern institutions. And among that, I would like just to highlight something. It is in some continents, and that implies, of course, Africa to start with, but that also implies Europe, we should look up at what Brazil is doing now. In Brazil, African history is now mandatory. And this is the kind of debate we should also have within our institutions. To which point should we not, we should be fighting for having this kind of approach for our younger students and recognizing the importance of African history in world history. I'm not an historian, so I'm free to say this. Okay, having said that, I will now give the floor to the other members of this roundtable by the order that you have in the program. So we'll start with Paul Nugent.
Okay, thank you. The microphone is on. Let me start by apologizing for my voice. Let me apologize for that as well. I think I've been partying too hard for the last 2 days, so it's catching up with me. I'm coming at this, I should say, from the point of view of somebody who is a product of the University of Cape Town, who went off to study Ghana, not to study South Africa, ended up in the UK, and then later on ended up being on the board and president of AEGIS for 7 years. So I've come at this from, I form my views on this from a number of different perspectives in my own trajectory, coming from my own trajectory. I'm not speaking on behalf of AEGIS, but what I'm going to say is informed by my engagement with AEGIS over the greater part of the last decade. I think within Europe, something quite interesting has happened in terms of the study of Africa. There was a boom period in the early 60s when centres were newly established, including my own in Edinburgh, but also Leiden and others. And that boom was sustained for a few years, and then it all sort of went rather quiet, and African studies went out of fashion, and not much new was created. And then, for some reason, in the early 2000s, there was a renewed interest in Africa, and I think this was very largely driven by student interest in Africa. It was partly driven by new funding arrangements and schemes, but I think it was a demand from below, if you like, for students in European institutions who wanted to study Africa, who wanted to be taught about African history and the other disciplines. And this led to a period of expansion. And this was reflected in AEGIS itself, where the initial membership, I think, consisted of 3 institutions. And then in the 2000s, the numbers sort of doubled every few years until we've reached the stage now where I think 28 or 29 members of AEGIS, and new ones continually being formed. The problem, of course, came with the great financial crisis after 2008, which threatened the study of Africa in a number of countries, and this was reflected in some closures, many mergers. In France, there were quite mergers. In other places, centres were put on ice. But on the whole, African studies in Europe survived the crisis reasonably well, I would say. And in some countries at the moment, it's in pretty robust health. I was just doing a series of assessments for the DFG, the German funding agency, and I was amazed by how much money is going into the study of Africa in Germany. I would say in Germany, African studies is in very good health. In the United Kingdom, we have our own problems, of course, Brexit and all that, but there are new centres of African studies being formed in Europe as we speak, especially in London. So if we take the European picture as a whole, I think African studies is looking pretty good shape. And that, I think, is something that's quite heartening. Now, the theme for this particular roundtable is challenges in African studies, and it seems to me that there are two challenges. The first relates to the specific relationship between African studies as a sub-branch of area studies and the disciplines. And this is a very tricky relationship, I think. As an editor of an African Studies journal, we noticed that the number of African submissions has gone up and the number of North American submissions has gone down. The reason why the number of North American submissions has gone down is that if you're a political scientist in a North American institution, or United States institution, you're not going to get many rewards from publishing in an area studies journal. So the tyranny of the discipline, if you like, is quite something. However, as with many things, there is another way of looking at it. Many African studies centres in Europe survived the Great Crash by, as it were, aligning themselves with the disciplines or finding some comfort by bringing themselves under the umbrella of something else. And in Germany, I think it's global studies, which has been part of what has enabled African studies to thrive. In other places, it's linking African studies to anthropology and so on. Development, African studies is often under the umbrella of something called development. And that has enabled African studies to survive, but it remains a very difficult relationship. One doesn't want, or at least I don't want, African studies to become a branch of development studies. I think African studies integrity. But it's enabled African studies to survive, so comes with its problems. The other is the big issue, which I'm sure many people will want to discuss here, which is the issue of knowledge production about Africa and in Africa, which is the tricky one. I think everybody talks the talk about the need for collaboration and the engagement with scholars in different places, and most especially with Africa, but it's more tricky than it seems. As the president of AEGIS, we tried for many, many years to, as it were, open the lines of communication with the African Studies Association. We had a series of meetings with Codesria. Similarly, we've had a series of roundtables, but we never got anywhere. And if there's any sense of failure that I got out of having been president for 7 years, it was the fact that we never got anywhere. So those kind of international institutional collaborations are really, I think, very difficult to instrumentalize. At the national level, it's slightly easier, and at the institutional level, at the university level, it is much easier because universities establish their own networks and their own contacts, but there's a limitation that goes with that. And then you have what I would call the network approach. I've been very heavily involved in the African Borderlands Research Network, which is really a network. It has no secretariat. It's totally acephalous. And yet it has been very successful precisely because it doesn't have all that institutional baggage. And one of the things that we did within AEGIS was to set up collaborative research groups, which was precisely an attempt to build on the energy that comes with the network. And I think in many ways, if one's looking to new ways of doing things, it's to the networks I would look rather than to the big institutional collaborations. Those might be. I suspect I'm running out of time, so I will finish on my final point, which is that African studies is as it were, consolidating as African studies on the African continent, but of course is now increasingly on the agenda elsewhere as well. And Clara has already mentioned Brazil, but Ton can tell us at least 6 or 7 countries in Asia and elsewhere where African studies is suddenly something of great interest to people, not purely driven by a kind of economic agenda. There's much more to that. And this means that African studies will become much more multipolar, if you like. And the role of Europe, therefore, within African studies will change. The questions people ask will change, and Europe's role in the study of Africa will change, maybe will diminish. The role for AEGIS, therefore, is one of getting its own act together, promoting African studies within Europe, and doing no more, I would say, than facilitating a dialogue with Africanists in other parts of the world. Europe cannot clearly be driving the agenda, but European African studies has its own take on things, and I think will continue to play an important role in future discussions.
Good morning, everybody. I thank you for this prestigious invitation, which I assume I owe more to than to any actual specialization in African studies, to my experience as facilitator of African studies in Brazil, maybe even as passeur of African studies. It is only recently that I've actually concentrated in terms of research on Africa. In my work, together with a group of colleagues, I try to incorporate African studies in the mainstream of the social studies, or social sciences, as a part of a larger effort to decolonize our production of knowledge in Brazil by developing new South-South links and promoting what I call a new horizontal curiosity, that is to say, a way to counter our historical vertical obsession with the global North. In fact, in preparing this speech, I could rely on a number of recent reports on African studies in Brazil, written by proper Africanists. Some were more positive, while others, such as Michel Cahin's, more critical. As we all know, African studies are not a natural fact, certainly not in the global South. And in each country there is a history of social... as we all know, African studies are not a natural fact and should not be seen as such. And in each country there is a history of social engineering, a political history of African studies, and Brazil is no exception. Ethnicity and demography are to be kept in mind. Whites in Brazil account for just about 44% of the population, and in certain states they are well under 20%. So when we are non-white, although we are whiter in the academia, less so nowadays, we are a non-white country. More than in other countries in in the Americas, in Brazil, Africa has historically been an important trope that has never left our national and foreign commentators indifferent, such as our racial composition. Either they loved it or they found it disgusting. But Africa has always been part of our discussion, rather as a problem, such as much as métissage. Africa in Brazil has never been, is always either a problem or a solution, but it's always been there. This is very different from many other countries, even in the Americas. As well as in the United States, identity or racial politics, if you want to call it like that, have had a bearing on the making of African studies. The main difference, besides, of course, the relative precariousness of our academic establishment when compared to the mighty United States, is that the relationship has been thus far more virtuous than vicious. There is no major tension, as there has been in the history of African studies and African American studies in the United States. Reconciling recently in many ways. African studies have had a profoundly political history in Brazil. They owe a lot to black activism and to the world of Afro-Brazilian religion, where memories of Africa, whatever Africa, whether a mythical, magical Africa, have been cherished and kept alive even in the toughest and most racist times of our history. So we have this mythical Africa in our background. A history of the South-South is still wanting. But it's beyond the scope of this short paper. Here, let it suffice by saying that African studies developed in two specific periods of our history that corresponded to two attempts to reposition our nation along the South-South axis. It originated with the progressive government of Goulart and its new foreign politics, very much in line with Bandung, interrupted by the 1964 coup. And the second step was from 2002, and was when it was this South-South connection, then for the first time called South-South, which was invented in 2002 in Brazil, the expression South-South, by Lula and the Dilma government, whose government has unfortunately been recently a victim of a new silent coup. So we had two moments of South-South with a coup, first proper coup, and now a silent coup. We have several different kind of coups. In 1959, the Center of African and Oriental Studies were at work, and later the Center of Afro-Asian Studies, interesting names, Afro-Oriental, Afro-Asian, in Rio de Janeiro. The first one is in Salvador, Bahia, the second one in Rio de Janeiro, were created, fostered by the government and only secondary by academics. It was mostly a political initiative and later became an academic initiative. Very different from the history of African studies in the United States, which I studied, because I did a biography of Herskovits in Brazil, and it's a completely different history. In the United States, they started within academia, then they needed to get political approval and resources. In Brazil, they started political, and then they become academic. In 2002, we had a very important 10369 federal law, which was a Copernican turn. That law made it compulsory the teaching of African and Afro-Brazilian and indigenous history at all levels of education. Whatever it might be, it was a federal law. So federal laws have to be abided by. This has been generating a lot of materials, a lot of discussion, knowledge production, what material in a situation, of course, where public schools in Brazil is in despair. So it worked better in universities, but anyway, created a positive for the first time in a country that sees itself as a mestizo country. For the first time, they need to produce ideas about Africa and some sort of multiculturalism. Anew, for the first time, because there are, as you know, multiculturalisms in very different ways. And it was coupled to affirmative action, quite massive affirmative action, which increased a lot the number of black students in universities. It created a new climate for a trust towards internationalization. And the question was, what kind of internationalization do you want to have? Because internationalization is one of the most pliable, syncretic expression you can think of. All in a sudden, Africa and blackness changed status from honors to bonus, even in a context. What is now the status quo? There is a number of centers, the one in Bahia where I work, which is different from the others, not only because of work, but because it hosts the only graduate program called Pois Afro in ethnic and African studies. Look at the combination. We thought of calling it Afro-Brazilian, we called it ethnic because we want to expand to, and we are expanding to Islam, now to India. It's an interdisciplinary master and doctoral program, which has been around for 12 years already, and it's unique in Latin America. That's also why we get quite a lot of students that tended to go to Mexico, to Colegio de Mexico, which only has a master program, then they do a master and they come and do a doctoral program with us, also because we have been able thus far to offer grants to students. Brazil had quite a generous, as I had up to today, quite a generous grant program. There is, and it's interdisciplinary. Of course, the position in the disciplines, I will touch on that in the end, is one of the challenges, especially because we are a very disciplinary country, more than many other countries. There are other centers in São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, where I also worked, Minas Gerais, Brasilia, which is, of course, where it is associated more with international studies. There is a recent new center in Maranhão, which was an offshoot of our center. 3 of our doctoral students created a small center, and they managed to create for the one and only graduate course undergraduate course, in African studies in Brazil, in the Amazon. Can you imagine? This is, of course, got to do with the political context. It is state of Maranhão is the state run by the Communist Party. It has helped. Communist Party in Brazil, Communist Party and Africa have gone hand in glove for some reasons in recent years. And of course, we have the UNILAB. Under Lula government, 2 universities were created. One on the border with Paraguay, which is a bilingual university, Spanish and Portuguese, and it's the University to make a long story short, the University of the Integration of Latin America, and the other one based in Fortaleza on the University of Integration with Africa. Magic projects, fantastic, underfunded, but anyway, they are there. Very much Latin American-wise. You create institution, then we study what we do about it. But they've been there, they've been inviting students, hiring quite a number of also of African scholars. There has been, over the last 2 years, still very at the beginning, an African Study Association has been created in Brazil. Of course, interdisciplinary, there are 2 or 3 journals, and there is more and more articles on Africa in mainstream journals, which I think is actually a very positive move. Translation in partnership with UNESCO of a number of classics. This is something we've been doing, a translation of classical production on African. And African students and scholars have been invited. They are essential to the graduate programs and to doctoral schools, as the one we've been doing for 18 years. Many of the I recognize many students of us called Factory of Ideas, which is a South-South summer school. It is for us, of course, as for many of you, essential that we get students from different countries, and we tend to get them mostly from Portuguese-speaking African countries, but we insist on not only focusing on Portuguese-speaking African countries. Language is a major problem in Brazil, as you can imagine. 3 minutes, blimey. Okay. the topics are quite interesting because somehow they reflect a South-South curiosity. Land rights, topics of our research in Africa, of our graduate students, for instance. Land rights, women leadership of social movements, heritage and biography, Creole societies. You see, there is always a link somehow with it's a mirror game. And here in passing, since I only have 3 minutes, I need to comment on the politics of funding. Brazil has moved from a country where people used to come to do tropical research onto a country, onto a research country, a country that develops its own research. This is a difficult turn, of course, and it's quite not only a epistemological change, but it's rife with contradictions. It's from a country, from receiver to a donor country. Now it is nothing because of the coup d'etat. We are in a situation of in a limbo. When compared to Europe, in Brazil there has not been a process of long-term structural investment in African studies or in any other area studies for that matter. For instance, there is no development studies in Latin America. It's quite interesting. And perhaps we consider ourselves already developed, but it's not a topic. It doesn't exist in our university. It's interesting to see in which country of the world people want to develop other countries, and which countries don't seem to want to do that. When money was available, it was used to pay grants to African scholars or to enable fieldwork in Africa, rather than institutions building or libraries. So we haven't got these nice buildings that you seem to have, particularly here. In spite of this inherent precariousness of African studies in Brazil, done from Brazil or from any other place in the global south, so-called, I think it offers a refreshing and new perspective on Africa, if only because of its different angles of observation and in general less imperial aura, which is not to say that we don't commit, we are not provincial, where we can also be very unpolite, south-south, but unpolite is not imperial, exact. In Brazil, and if I can expand all over South America, African studies cannot and must not be developed along the lines they were developed in the global north. We have not got the past, nor the resources for that. Neither we have a similar ethnographic or historiographic sensibility. We insist in asking our African colleagues and the organization, CODESRE, what do they need and expect of us, for instance, all the time. And we should ask it over and over again, to my opinion. Okay, let me shorten the whole things. So doing African studies from Brazil is also a way to decolonize our mind and oxygenate our curricula in all the disciplines. This is something I've really been working on, stimulating a South-South perspective at the cost of our historical vertical obsession with the North. In closing, I want to stress that the South-South is still fragile and very much subjected to the whimsies of national and international politics. Generally speaking, progressive government emphasize it more than conservative government. Just look at India, look at South Africa and Brazil, which at least in our regions tend to be more in line with the US. Conservative government in Latin America tend to be more in line with the US and less interested. So what they do, they start closing agencies, shutting down embassies or reducing them to consulate in Africa. So this is happening to Argentina, happening to Brazil. When we had a wave of Brazilian and Argentinian and Venezuelan diplomacy in Africa was amazing last decade, and it's now shrinking again. I would therefore like to suggest, in closing, that AEGIS makes it as one of its priorities to help making the South sustainable. This is especially important in our changing world, where, for instance, 3 BRICS countries, as I mentioned, are in crisis and risk isolation. Challenges: consolidation, of course. How do you move from a generous, innocent, and sometimes stupid moment of creation of African studies into something consolidated? And which direction should you consolidate? Development, South-South, international studies, God knows. Finding a place in the disciplines. As I said, there is no development studies in Brazil. International studies are certainly underdeveloped. So when we say the discipline, we say the big disciplines, in the main disciplines. 1 minute, finished. And insisting, as we do, in contributing to graduate studies in Africa itself. I know it is difficult to deal with CODESRE, as it is difficult to deal with CLACSO, but we have to insist on that, and we have to insist on one-to-one connection to graduate program in Africa, because although we're weak, we like to think that we should contribute to consolidating African studies, graduate studies in Africa itself. Thank you.
So I'll now give the word to Anne Peacher from the African Studies Association.
Yes, so I'm speaking as the president of the African Studies Association in the U.S., but also as a professor at the University of Michigan. So I will talk a bit about the ASA, I'll talk a bit about African studies in the United States, and then I'll talk about the challenges we're facing. With regard to the African Studies Association, I think we are in an excellent place. We are financially healthy after suffering quite a bit during the financial crisis and during our own internal crisis. We are now extremely healthy financially. We have an excellent secretariat, and the executive director is here this morning. It's experienced at this point, it's extremely professional, and the organization is very well run. We have a growing membership and increased conference attendance, which I think speaks to the vitality of African studies in the U.S. and beyond, since we have a lot of members who are based abroad. We have several new initiatives that I think speak to the vitality of African studies in the United States and also to the new directions that the ASA USA is going in. This year we offered grants to our many coordinate organizations. We also have these groups that are affiliated to us in political science, or they might be focused on Uganda or Mande studies. This year we gave grants to them to support efforts that they've undertaken to include Africa-based scholars on panels or to host conferences or workshops on the continent. Our flagship journal, the African Studies Review, has a new editor, also incoming editor, also in the audience, Ben Lawrence. And I'm so pleased because the first thing he did was create an editorial team that includes 2 scholars based on the continent. So for the first time, the editorial team of African Studies Review has African scholars who are at African institutions. The ASR has also already scheduled a workshop that will take place in Ghana to encourage scholars based on the African continent to submit work to the journal. The African Studies Association is also now engaging in joint conferences. They hosted one with American Anthropological Association, with Kodesria, and with Warwick in Dakar that was extremely successful. We have another one in the pipeline with the American Anthropological Association and with some organizations in South Africa. So we're really trying to shift our focus very obviously towards much more engagement with the continent and on the continent. We also have increased our fellowship and funding opportunities for Africa-based scholars, and here we've worked with a lot of foundations in the United States to make opportunities available for more emerging scholars from Africa to attend our meetings and to attend other professional meetings. So we're working with professional organizations in the United States like American Political Science Association and AAA to bring more scholars to meetings in the United States. I think that our vitality as an association is a reflection of the health of the field of African studies in the United States in spite of the attacks on area studies, in spite of the increased siloing of the disciplines. And just as an example, last year, over 70 books from authors based in the US, Europe, and Africa were considered for our top prize, the Herskovits Award. I think that, and I read a lot of these books actually, because my husband's on the committee. So I glanced at all of these and read many of them cover to cover. And it's just astounding to me the contributions that scholars are making in such diverse fields, from the study of art in Nigeria. In fact, it's almost like a joke now that a book on art in Nigeria will win the Herskovits Award, because there have been so many excellent publications on various facets of art and artistic production in Nigeria. But performance in West Africa, the digital humanities, political science. We're even seeing work on public health, and an increase in panels on public health, and an increased presence of Africans on social media, and engagement with social media, and analysis of social media in Africa at the African Studies meetings. I think all of these fields are being enriched because increasingly we're engaging in personal and institutional partnerships with Africans based in Africa, and also because we're receiving so much input from the diaspora who are based in the United States. So I think it's an incredibly exciting, intellectually productive time for African studies in the United States. I would say if we were a city-state, like, our fortifications are incredibly strong. And they need to be, because the transition to a new president in our country, and a new regime in November has produced enormous challenges for us. This is an administration that abhors internationalization. They abhor cross-cultural exchange. They don't want global citizens. They don't want global understanding. In the first 6 months of the Trump administration, as probably many of you know, we had a travel ban that initially included 3 countries in Africa, now includes 2 countries in Africa, and recently we see that the Supreme Court is opening the door to the acceptance of that travel ban. I think this is indicative of a large-scale policy to demonize Muslims and to restrict immigration, especially from the Middle East, but also from Africa. These kinds of bans don't just affect people who want to migrate to the United States, or who want to attend conferences in the United States. That's one issue, but it's also affecting the African diaspora in the United States who want to travel to Europe to attend conferences, or who want to go back to their countries and visit their families. I have a student who is not at this conference because he is afraid to leave the United States. So therefore, we miss the opportunity of their contribution to the study of Africa, because they cannot go home, they cannot go to Europe, they're trapped in the United States. We are also seeing on the agenda the elimination of a program that you might not be familiar with, but it is a program that has provided the foundation for a lot of study of Africa in the United States. It's referred to as Title VI. It finances about 9 or 10 centers across the country. We have representatives from some of those centers, like Northwestern, University of Florida, here at the conference, and here in the room. Those centers have been financed by Title VI, and that is under threat for the 2018 budget in the United States. There are 100 in the United States. There are about 100 national resource centers that across the United States that address world regions and the study of foreign languages, not just African languages, but foreign languages in general. Those two are under threat by the U.S. government. Fulbright Hayes is a program that provides grants for graduate students. I myself received one as a graduate student. Many students have depended on these grants to do research in Ghana, Mozambique, Congo, Zimbabwe. All of these types of programs in the 2018 proposed presidential budget are basically being slashed. Humanities funding in general in the United States, of which Africa is a part, is about to be cut completely. The budget request for the National Endowment for the Humanities is $42 million, only $42 million for 2018, and the purpose of that budget request for 2018 is to ensure the orderly closure of the agency. The money is being requested in order to close the agency. This agency, for the last 50 years, has funded programs at historically black colleges. They have funded collaborative research grants. They have funded fellowships. They have funded the bringing of artwork from the African continent to display in museums across the United States. That program has funded the growth of the digital humanities, and it's now under threat. So what do we do? In the 160 days since the Trump administration took office, the larger pattern is clear. There is a shift in how we view the international, in how this administration views the other, in how we treat difference. We are seeing increased militarization in our culture, in our policies, and in our values. This has profound implications for African Studies Association and for African Studies. More importantly, for our country, for the way that our country interacts with the world. It solidifies a current that was always present in the United States of American exceptionalism, of isolationism. And you might think, and I kind of think, well, good, you know, America's going to fall from the pedestal they've been on, you know, from the moral high ground that they've always occupied. In an unacceptable way, they've occupied that moral high ground. I agree with you. I want that over. But this country has power, and the way that they are using this power is really disturbing. So our approach in ASA, and if you just give me an extra minute to say this, is obviously to be as active as we can be. We are mobilizing, we are writing letters, we are working with other organizations, we are increasing our partnerships with others as much as we can. We are involved with Scholars at Risk. The incoming editor of African Studies Review has done an incredible job working on asylum cases for African migrants who are trying to stay in the United States. The ASA has a database of expert witnesses to try and support people who are under threat by our government. So we do a lot of advocacy ourselves, but we are also asking for help from our transnational partners. I've heard a lot of talk about transnationalism at this conference, and I hope that that will also extend to fighting on our behalf and supporting us in our efforts to survive. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'll now give word to Professor Motoji Matsuda from the University of Kyoto.
So first, on behalf of JAS, Japanese Association for African Studies, I'd like to thank you very much to invite us to this roundtable, because we are a very new member of the affiliate member of the AEGIS. And in this conference, 10 or more JAS members, young members, joined and make a presentation. And here, I'll explain our just uniqueness and the challenges so that we could make a meaningful contribution to promote the world African studies. Before presentation, let me introduce myself briefly. I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I got my MA sociology from Nairobi University. Now, since I started my fieldwork at an informal shanty settlement in Nairobi in 1979, I have continued my research in Kenya, so my Swahili is much better than my English. And so the current membership is around 800. It is the largest area studies association in Japan. This is the gender ratio. Since the late 1990s, the female members are drastically increasing. And we are an interdisciplinary area studies association, but interestingly, we have strong presence of natural scientists since it was established. As we show later in our annual meeting, there are many presentations from these natural sciences. In Japan, the first generation of African study did their field work in late 1950s in Tanganyika and Congo. They focus on the primatology, especially gorilla and chimpanzee studies. JAS was established in 1964 by only 40 members. The membership has continued to rise since then, like this. And we have three major activities. That is publication of Japanese Journal of African Studies, organization of annual meeting, and networking with other area studies association in Japan, and other African studies association overseas like Korea and China and India. Well, let me show you the brief contents of the recent volume. Like it looks like a global trend. As to the annual meeting, we have around 100 presentations, including human, social, natural sciences, and enjoyed cross-disciplinary learning and discussion. Let me show you a part of our program this year, or maybe you cannot see, but you can see the many presentations from natural science, geology, the zoology, primatology, ecologies are found there. The research trend. We have published as many as 500 articles on our Journal of African Studies since 1964. The cultural anthropology has led just research activities. It is still a major discipline today. The left graph shows the area of research field of the 500 articles. We have three periods. The first period is 60s, 70s, the blue. The second one is 80s, 90s, green. And the third one is after 2000, the orange. The research activities in Southern Africa are becoming active in the third period. The right graph shows the research trend by each discipline. Cultural anthropology still occupies the majority status, while the gender studies and the development studies are becoming important discipline in the third phase. But please pay attention to the number of the discipline of natural sciences. When we start cooperation and collaboration with other African Studies Association, we are realizing our particularity or peculiarity and uniqueness that have the strong side and strong points and weak points also. The first characteristic of Japanese-style African studies has been, and still is, the strong inclination towards the fieldwork. Particularly one-sidism, we call it jokingly monogamous style of relationship with research field. Once the Japanese Africanist chooses his or her field site, the relation could be expected to continue throughout the life. In this thinking, the inclination towards the theorization is given little recognition. The second characteristic is group-based research. Many Japanese Africanists do their individual research in group. It is because of the Japanese research funding system. Usually, when we plan to make a research in Africa, we apply for the research fund to Japan Society of Promotion of Sciences, semi-governmental funding agencies. There are roughly 4 categories for it. That is type S, A, B, and C. And only type C is for funding of one researcher, while other categories are for group-based research funding. So the S type, I'm heading one of this. It is focus on the conflict resolution through the African local agencies. The A type, tourism, primatology, ecology. The B type, history, literature, political science. C type, refugee studies, the oral tradition. And the third, the distinctive feature of JAS is to keep our studies from policy making and implementation of Japanese government as well as international agencies. As a matter of course, this mentality and attitude are changing these days. And some are actively cooperating with government agencies. But the majority is still having these mentalities and hesitating to be involved in any government-initiated project. It has a historical reason. Before and during the war, Japanese academia aggressively cooperated with the military. After the war, our seniors expressed deep remorse over the past war cooperation and have decided to keep a distance from not only the state power, but also the political commitment in general. Thus, they could acquire a more positivistic attitude in their research. Last year, Japanese government held the 6th TICAD meeting in Nairobi. TICAD is a Tokyo International Conference on African Development. Although TICAD has played an important role in African development since 1993, Japanese government never asked JAS us for assistance or cooperation. And we, JAS, never demand active involvement in this. So these peculiarity or particularity are unique characteristics of Japanese African studies have both merits and demerits. One field site is leading us to thick and deep description, but at the same time, it has a negative effects on the local community, and it could neglect the theory and civilization. The group-based research style can help us to share the common research framework so that we can make more integrated and comprehensive comparative work. But common framework, research theme, and even the field site are imposed on the team members. And the distanciation from government helps us to place ourselves free from colonial or post-colonial style of imposition from above. But this apolitical attitude leads us to escape from active engagement, such as human rights protection. Our challenge for the future focuses on the 2 points. One is related with the long-time debates on the, I skipped this. And the second, the challenge, the most important, is to polycentralize the mode of knowledge production in African studies. Since African studies emerged as an academic category, they have been dominated by Euro-American scholars, and their modes of knowledge production have been hegemonic. Others who joined later, including African scholars and Asian scholars like us, are still under the strong influence of these hegemonic modes of knowledge production. We know the hegemonic mode of this hegemonic mode has made a great contribution. We cannot deny it, but we dream. pluralization of mode of knowledge production in African studies, if we could recognize other or different mode of knowledge production in African studies, we could explore the much better cooperation for the world African studies in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And now I'll give word to Professor Lungisile Ntsebeza from the University of Cape Town.
Okay, thank you. Now, I see now we're out of time, so I'll try and raise now points now that hopefully can be taken up during the discussion. I speak here as an African scholar and scholar based on the African continent. So I am not an Africanist. I am an insider, and this is how people should understand my presentation here. I am the director of the Center for African Studies at the University of Cape Town, and I'm also the inaugural president elected in absentia in 2013 of the African Studies Association of Africa. So I would, my presentation will touch on those two phases of my intellectual life. As the director of African Studies at UCT, and I suppose now as the inaugural president, I wish I could sort of tell a story that is similar to the African Studies Association as presented by Anne. You know, that well-funded and all the good things she had to say. We are new, we're still struggling, we are grappling with issues. We're not apologetic about that. We need support, but we don't need sympathy. UCT, ironically, has the longest tradition of studying Africa. If I'm not wrong, the study of Africa is probably, UCT has the longest tradition of the study of Africa. The School of Bantu Life and Bantu Languages, as it was then called, was established in 1920. Dominated by anthropologists, later archaeologists and people in the Department of Bantu languages, later African languages. The school had a certain orientation, which some of us know would, for lack of a better word, dub as colonial tradition. And in 1973, that tradition came to an end with when Monica Wilson, well-known anthropologist, retired from UCT. But the interesting thing is that 2 years later, when Harry Oppenheimer, the gold magnate, was the chancellor of UCT, and at a time when there were great revolutionary changes in Southern Africa, the fall of the Portuguese Empire and so on, Oppenheimer contributed a lot of money for the re-establishment of African studies at UCT. So in 1975, we had what is now called the Center for African Studies. And this is the center that I'm director of. And Oppenheimer donated money. We put up a building, posh building at the University of Cape Town. Also donated money for an endowed chair, established the A.C. Jordan Research Chair, and that's one of the chairs that I'm sitting on. And that chair, of course, now has had an unfortunate history. First of all, one of the first applicants was Achima Ferge, of you would know, and And UCT, over and above what they did to him in 1968, refused to interview him for the East Jordan chair. And they later gave that chair to Mahmoud Mamdani, who was the first occupant of that chair, 1996 to 1999. And Mahmoud left UCT under controversy for Colombo University. I'm sure some of you would be familiar with that history. And between 1999 and 2012, the AC Jordan chair was vacant. And it was resuscitated in 2012. I applied for it, and got the chair. And the 12 years, 13 years between 1999 and 2012 saw a decline of African studies at UCT. So from that period, that Mamdani period, where UCT was on the map and so on, all of a sudden there was this sharp decline. In fact, in 2010, the Center for African Studies was on the verge of being, a term that we use, disestablished. And some of us, I was not involved in African studies, I was a professor in sociology. Some of us now ended taking up this issue with the university, and now we succeeded. And so the center is still alive. I'm not sure whether one can be comfortable. Now, the issue that I faced when I took over the Center for African Studies and focused on African studies was that I noticed that the university did not commit any funding towards African studies. I was told that if I want to run the Center for African Studies, I would have to raise my own funding. That in the form funding is is dispersed at UCT, and I think this happens in other universities. If you don't teach, if you don't have students and so on, then the university wouldn't give you a permanent post. So that was one problem. The other problem comes from my colleagues in other departments. And my colleagues tell me that there's no need for African studies at UCT. There's no need for African studies on the African continent. That what we do in the Center for African Studies is what they do in their departments. That they teach Africa, and if we were to promote African studies, it would just be a mere and unnecessary repetition. And then, of course, there's the larger question about African studies in Africa. And people will say, why African studies in Africa? And some even make ridiculous claims, that are you doing area studies? So what we are trying to do now, or have to do now, is to try and rethink what African studies means for those of us who are Africans but based on the continent. And there's a thing. For myself, I'll be done. Okay. And the interesting questions that are coming out of that. Now, what has happened, and which is what makes the whole thing interesting, is that over the last 2 years, most of you would know, there has been a student-led campaign that started at UCT with protests against the statue of Cecil John Rhodes at UCT, and led to the Rhodes Must Fall movement, His Must Fall movement, and that in many ways rescued African studies at UCT, in the sense that the very colleagues who were telling us that they are Africanizing in their curriculum, in their teaching and so on, were told by students that they must decolonize their curriculum. So that's put us in a stronger position to say that you say you have decolonized the curriculum, but the very people who are receiving information are saying you are not. So there has been an interest now in the work we are doing at UCT, and this year we have been allowed to offer an undergraduate study an undergraduate major in African Studies, and the center, that is the university administration, the rectorate or the committee of the vice chancellor, they've now come to us, to ask us whether we cannot consider, designing a course, a university-wide course on the study of Africa, which would mean that, like in Ghana, all students who graduate at State UCT, would have at least a semester course in African studies. This is where things are, and you can take up some of these. On a continent basis, and I've been one of the founders of the establishment of the African Studies Association of Africa. And we have a website, and details of how that center, that association was established, on the website. Just want to highlight, a couple of difficulties in getting that association together. One is, and I was surprised, is the difficulty of us meeting, right? And the visa problem remains a big issue. I was elected in absentia in Ghana precisely because I couldn't get a visa to fly to Accra. And some of my colleagues relate embarrassing stories where they travel with Europeans, Americans, and at the airport, the African is turned back, and Europeans and Americans not allowed through. It's crazy, but it happens. And it makes it difficult for us to consolidate. Then there's also the question of traveling, the cost. I went to Cameroon, but I had to fly to Zurich and another place in Africa before I got to Cameroon. It's just, you could walk from Cape Town to Cameroon. You cross. And then there's a question of securing membership of scholars based on the continent. They're struggling. The universities are not paying, and often our colleagues, we know it's an old story, you know it. Our colleagues end up doing consultancy work more than academic work. But despite that, they find it difficult to pay the membership fee that makes one a duly paid member. There's also the question of the banking system, and this is what I'm just learning. Right? There's a question of the banking system where, say, for people who, in Nigeria, for example, I'm just making an example, if you want to pay your membership fee through a bank in Nigeria, this is an example, you find that the bank charges are more than your membership fee. And that's enough to discourage people from being members now. Because, this is new. It was less than 5 years, 4 years since the association was established. And these are the issues that we're grappling with. Key issue, just to close, a key issue is whether we formalize ourselves like you people, an association and so on, or whether we should build from below through NOTEX and so on, and deal with these numerous problems.
Thank you so much. So we are now giving the floor to Professor Narnia Bohler from the Human Science Research Council and the African Institute in South Africa.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to present, and I'm very well aware that there's not going to be much time for discussion or questions. So please flag me at the 10-minute mark and I'll stop. I'm from the Human Sciences Research Council and the Africa Institute of South Africa, so I just want to explain that particular issue from the outset. The Human Sciences Research Council and the Africa Institute for South Africa were two separate science councils in South Africa in the past, under the supervision in some sense of the Departments of Science and Technology. And I was involved with the Institute prior to going to the HSRC when the two institutes were separate. However, because of cost-cutting measures and concerns around the impact of the work of the Africa Institute of South Africa, it was incorporated into the Human Sciences Research Council in 2013. Now, there was a lot of unhappiness. I think Lungisile was one of the people who was not happy with the move for the incorporation of the Institute into the Human Sciences Research Council, because it was thought that there would be a dilution of African studies because the Human Sciences Research Council had such a broad mandate. However, the minister did retain ring-fenced funding for African studies within the Human Sciences Research Council, and therefore the two funding models are different. The funding model for AISA, as we call it, is available there for the researchers to do fieldwork in Africa, development-focused fieldwork just out of interest. And then the Human Sciences Research Council has a different funding model where, as with Lungisile at UCT, we have to raise money in order to do the work that we do. But we also have a centralized African Studies Committee that has now been established to ensure that whatever we do is African-centered at the HSRC. So it's a very good thing, I think, that the two institutions were merged, because it's made the HSRC as an institution also aware of the fact that the research should be rooted and contextualized in terms of the African continent. Mm-hmm. So that's just the context of where I come from and where we come from. So in terms of the research that we do, there are a number of challenges. I'm going to focus on the challenges, although there are a number of good things that are happening as well, such as this increased focus on Africa within the organization as a whole. But let me just go through some challenges, not only in terms of our own research organization, but challenges across the country when it comes to studying Africa or African studies or Africanism. There's very many different ways of looking at this, of course. So to speak about it as a homogeneous issue is completely incorrect, of course. The first is the decolonization of knowledge. Now, this sounds easy, but it really isn't. There's a big debate in South Africa, started to some extent by the Rhodes Must Fall movement, as well as the Fees Must Fall movement, that knowledge should be decolonized within the space of higher education. But of course, it's much broader than that. The decolonization of knowledge should happen from when children are very young. So that's the first thing. And related to that is the issue of language. Being taught in mother tongue at a very young age has been proven to increase understanding. And of course, bilingualism or multilingualism assists the child's brain to develop in a way that improves understanding and also perhaps improves meaning in the life of that child. So it starts from a very young age, and that's something that I think we are lacking in terms of the debates in South Africa. The other issue, of course, is ridding the sort of knowledge production in South Africa and in Africa of westernization, imperialism, and so on and so forth. This also is not very easy because it's already embedded in whatever we do. And I think that Eliseo demonstrated that very well in the plenary address, where, you know, so we can't think in binaries anymore. And so when we look at sort of influences, we need to be aware of those and contextualize them. But simultaneously, if we're going to work in a global world and not be parochial and not be isolationist, we obviously need to take into account knowledge that has been generated throughout history. And if we don't understand that, of course, then we cannot work through the pain of some of the history that has been experienced throughout the continent as well as throughout the world. And then, of course, the content. When we decolonize knowledge, what kind of content are we taking into consideration? Now, I come from an interesting background in terms of higher education. There was a university in South Africa known as Vista University. It was a black university in South Africa, and the campuses were located in townships. And there were, I think, 7 campuses throughout the country located in townships. And predominantly black students were taught at Vista University. So I started teaching there when I was very young. And we also taught evening classes. So we would have multiracial evening classes because we were the only university in the Eastern Cape, actually, that offered evening classes. At that stage, I was teaching law. So there was this space that people occupied within the context of Vista University, and we started Africanizing the curriculum already 15 years ago. And unfortunately, because the university was seen to be a spin-off of apartheid, the university was unbundled, as they call it, and then the campuses were incorporated into historically white universities. And that caused a tremendous amount of discomfort to the students. The students themselves were protesting the unbundling of the university, and you know, for many years, and I still keep in contact with students that I taught. For many years, the students felt uncomfortable in this space. So this new kind of like, you know, for example, the University of Port Elizabeth that we were incorporated into was a historically Afrikaner university with completely different culture. And yes, attempting to transform, but transforming in a relatively slow way. So that's the first thing, you know, the whole issue of decolonization of spaces in which people feel comfortable, in, you know, not having, you know, photographs of white men staring down at you in corridors and in classrooms. The other one is this is a word I made up last night, patriarchalization of knowledge. So, I mean, it's really important for us not to forget that. And there's a tremendous history, maybe even more so than colonialism in terms of patriarchy all over the world. And that includes African knowledge production. So, you know, when you read about the famous, you know, the people, Mafeje, Mamdani, and the huge fight that they had, you know, the elephants. So, you know, this whole issue of big brother in Africa, it's there, and we can't ignore it. There are very few influential women African thinkers, and it's not because they're not able to think. It's probably about the issue of voice. So whose voices are heard, whose voices are excluded, and why? So we really need to look at the issue of patriarchy and the way in which patriarchy molds knowledge production on the continent and, of course, elsewhere. And this has to do with narratives and voices and the recognition of women in the production of knowledge. And the last problem, of course, or challenge that we have is funding. When we look at the issue of studying Africa and African studies, there's very little money going around in terms of supporting this kind of research. And it is important to start agitating more for research to happen, and not necessarily developmentally focused research or policy-focused research, but as we call sometimes blue sky, African sky blue research. And so when it comes to funding and donor organizations, it would be very useful for those organizations to look at the issue of African studies in its context, and to ensure that there is space for thinking by Africans about Africa, and of course the whole area of STEM is also a serious concern within the context of Africa. Women and girls are just not becoming involved in this area of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And so we need to put some money into ensuring that we have a sort of movement on the continent to encourage women and girls to enter these areas. Thank you.
Thank you. So we are coming to the end of this roundtable, but we still have time for some questions. So I'll open the floor to the audience and collect 3 questions. If you have them, please drop in. 1, 2, 3. So we have our 3 questions.
Professor of Linguistics, General Linguistics and African Linguistics at Emeritus University of Zurich. I'm here because I'm aware of the implications of my field for social studies and vice versa. I was struck by the fact that 3 of my colleagues sitting in the panel, I can't tell the names, from Ghana,
South Africa.
Michigan.
South Africa. South Africa.
South Africa, excuse me. From Michigan, and the colleague
South Africa.
Last, there was a definite accent as I heard that. Of course, I'm biased by my discipline in listening. But there was a convergence to insist on, say, things like language courses, which are going to be suppressed, or anyway, the importance of language for African studies and language diversity for African studies. So my question is, what is the importance from your viewpoint of integrating African language in the broadest sense, to which you can count French and so on, into all in an interdisciplinary approach to African studies. And if a revival of African language studies in that sense is desirable, it may not be, but it could be. If it was, what direction should it take?
Thank you. There was someone down there. Sorry.
Thank you, Professor Lungisile. I've come to understand the ontological as well as the epistemological underpinnings of what would constitute the African studies rationale. But I'm still trying to understand the methodological commitment of the African studies. Should it come to occupy a disciplinary dignity in the larger intellectual discourse? What are the methodological commitments it should have?
Thank you. And now, someone up here, yeah?
Well, I first want to say thank you guys so much for the information. I'm an African from America. I grew up very young. I'm from Liberia. I grew up in the States. So I have a very unique perspective of being African. I actually have a master's in African studies from UCLA. And when I graduated, there really wasn't a job for me because other than teaching African studies, there's really not a use for that field. So when you guys spoke about having another discipline, I think that's very important. So I went and got a master's in urban planning so that when I go to Africa, I could actually bring something to Africa. And I really appreciate what this, and I'm not going to say your name because I don't want to butcher anyone's name, but the speaker from South Africa.
Lungisile.
Yes, when your colleague said, well, what is the need for African studies in Africa? There is no more of an appropriate place to have African studies than in Africa, because outside of Africa, there are people from all over the world teaching about Africa. So where would you get the most accurate information from Africans themselves? So I think that's very important that we have more programs in Africa, and that in the diaspora of African studies, that it be more of a requirement that students who are studying African studies actually go to Africa prior to completing their degrees, because a lot of the information that I learned in theory, in the books, when I actually went back for the first time after 20 years, there was a lot of contradictions, a lot of things that I said, oh, okay, well, that's not correct. So I really do appreciate from Brazil hearing that you guys are making a requirement that African studies is being taught at a younger age, because that is one of the biggest challenges in the U.S. with Black Americans, African Americans, not really learning anything about Africa until they get to university. That's if they get to university. So for my 12 years of primary and secondary education, I learned maybe 3 days or 1 week of history of Africa prior to going to college. So I think the African Association in the U.S. could do a lot more, maybe being more active in assisting in getting African studies into the school system in the U.S. Prior to university. So my question that I have for yes, I need to say this. What was the catalyst for the Brazilian government to make it a requirement? Because I think that's one thing the U.S. and Brazil share in common, is that history of like the largest population of people of African descent outside of Africa. And that is something that you guys are actually ahead of the game when it comes to what Black people in the U.S. have accomplished versus in Brazil. So that was my question to you. And then my question to the U.S. panelists is, at the university level, you have African studies and you have African American studies, and you don't see a lot of African Americans in African studies unless you go to the historically Black colleges. And I think that is a problem too, because in African studies, you only have pretty much Africans, and they're the ones who are getting the scholarships or the opportunities to come from Africa to the U.S. They're getting a perspective more of like a Eurocentric perspective, and they're not really interacting with the Africans in America, because that's how some people do refer themselves. So what can be done to reconcile that?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Now, please, more 4 minutes of your attention. I'll go on the other side. The question is maybe not for everyone. I don't know, Narnia, if you want to answer.
Just the linguistic or the language issue, because I had mentioned it. In South Africa, it's quite a complicated issue, in the sense that we have 11 official languages recognized in the Constitution. So when we talk about language, there's a little bit of politics involved in languages as well. and the use of languages. There's ethnic affiliations regarding this as well. So it's not a simple matter of deciding, which languages would be most suitable for the teaching of African studies, because of the fact that there are these issues around language and language use in South Africa that have political undertones.
Sorry, Paul, I'll pass directly to Anne.
Yeah, I only have a minute, I've been told, so I am going to just address the question about the study of Africa prior to getting into college. I think it's a terrible problem. Part of the funding for Title VI programs in the United States is meant to be directed to something called K through 12 outreach. I think asking Title VI centers to be responsible for teaching African studies to local high schools is not the way to do it. I agree there needs to be more of a commitment from universities, making sure that local high schools address African studies. And, obviously this ought to have come from the top. It ought to have come from the top under the previous administration in the United States. It's certainly not going to happen with this administration. So all we can hope for is that through our own efforts, we can expand the study of Africa. But you make a good point, and I think the ASA ought to probably be doing more. We are doing some.
Thank you.
On the issue of language, I suppose it also touched on the methodological issues. I think the debate as I understand it now in our country now, is between monolingualism and multilingualism. And there are people who who support monolingualism, who often quote Ngugi, that the story is told from the side of the hunter and not the hunted. And yeah, I don't know whether this is what Ngugi meant, but my view is that as academics, we should be as interested in the story of the lion as we are interested in our own stories. So it's not either or. So on the issue of language, I would say multilingualism is fine. Some of the things we are using a foreign language, but we are able to articulate our point using that foreign language. So, and you can be as effective in a foreign language as in another language. And in a society that is globalizing and so on, it is important that we produce people for the world, rather than people who will be restricted to where they come.
Just 1 minute. There is still a lot to be done, but the federal law created a new network, a framework. It was a result of a magic moment because it was ruled unanimously in favor of that law that made it compulsory the teaching of African studies, and affirmative action. It was ruled unanimously by the Supreme Court in 2002. There was this really magic moment in Brazil, which I doubt will be repeated. It was the result of 3 groups pressing. Black activism, which wanted, we're speaking of a social debt towards the black population of Brazil, was a moment of reparation, that was a word, social reparation, and as opposed to money reparation, social reparation, and the Catholic, a wing of the Catholic Church, the Pastoral do Negro, was very important as well. The second group, which is an interesting combination, which we can be proud of, was a combination of anti-colonial activists and historians of Africa who were quite influential, and groups of refugees who had been influential in Brazil from MPLA and Frelimo. They were pressing the diplomatic corps. The diplomatic corps was in favor of that. So there was a special moment, and now the question is how to develop it. But black activism is the general backdrop.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming this morning, and I hope this is the beginning of a great network between African studies worldwide. Thank you.
first name of Ntsebeza, ethnicity.
Back to doing
And this
based in Edinburgh, doing my
can use both and
program.
initiative and semi-evaluate.
Just advisory council, so I haven't.
Always use both. Because sometimes it's struggling to get like, especially in this program,
Others to take over.
you may know.
Hi.
And yes, I'm okay. Okay. Okay, let's talk. In the US.
We work so closely with the COSWA on organizing this workshop and everything. It's been really exciting. So there's so many opportunities for partnership. I know you guys are an important organization, but we're still figuring out just how we can be a support. And I'm not sure if it's with the COSWA or with you in terms of when you transition officially when you become the president.
This is some of the issues. It's perspectives. I mean, it's really young.
Yes. Are you going to be in Chicago this year? ASA?
End of the year?
In November, yeah.
Sure. Is it late? Is it late?
Make it would be fabulous because I talked a little bit with the COSWA last year about this, but I think there's something that we can do. So what we do for some of our partner organizations is we actually provide the online systems for membership. We provide the online systems and we've dealt with all the training issues because we've had to, for example, for a lot of our partner organizations that have had these problems, we just set up a website where they monitor our infrastructure for people to come and pay their membership dues and we transfer them to you that way. And so there's a lot of things I think in terms of administrative support, there's probably a lot of things that have a lot of
It reminds me
see, this is part of it. So
this issue of there's this big brother image that we have like UCT that I speak for the it's almost like being selfish because if I sympathize with UCT
you have to
say that no, we are not proceeding with this transaction until you have like this requirement. And those things that we have, what I'm learning is that with this business, we have to learn to have this learning.
What we have to learn to, this is why a lot of our organizations, we had to learn administration for that because for us, I pay for an audit every year. It's really easy for me to include our corporate organizations under my audit, that they have audited secrets. But any one of them ended up themselves, they had to pay for an audit, and we had to be back involved. So my colleague, Catherine, who's our program manager for outreach, is going to be at the workshop in Ghana. I'm not able to attend, but Catherine is going to do some talk. She's going to be there together with Benjamin Lawrence from African Studies Review. So the two of them will be there, so maybe that's a good opportunity to sit down and kind of talk through any way we can be of support. And I'm happy to get rid of all those challenges.
I know. Yeah. But I mean, the idea is there. I mean, the enthusiasm is in the range. We know the programs to all we have to do.
One of the things I think would be interesting just to comment is that, we have a very strong American Studies Association in the U.S., right? So when people start questioning the validity of African studies in Africa,
based on the
maybe they
continent.
should look at what does American studies do in America, right? Or what does European studies do in Europe, right? Because those are parallel models. Okay. Brother, let me go to the room. Where are you?
Yeah, we'll wait for you.
Let's go to the room.
We can meet them in coffee.
Yeah. Let's want to go to the room.
Eu sou diretora do centro, mas
How are you?
estou lá.
But I want to meet you.
Muito obrigada. Olha, Tiana Silva, está lá, está Exactly. Oh, I'm sorry. No. Oh, it's a pity. There was a person that organized the workshop. He was here. But never mind. Yeah, Brazilian person. I was thinking about coming anywhere. Our problem is, you know, she was here just a moment ago. Yeah. But I'll present you outside.
Maybe I've been
That would be great.
I'm going to try to find her later and to present you. Okay? Yeah. Now I know. Okay, great.
Last few years I was in Minnesota. I still live in Minneapolis. Because I'm in a big city.
Yes, I am. Yes, she's a dear friend of mine. Yes, she is. Yes, you have, Derek Peterson. Yes, I've heard. We've also hosted Ntsebeza from Ethiopia. Yeah, who was also at Miser. And and I know Miser a little bit myself because I did some work in Uganda a long time ago, 2001, 2003. In fact, my child attended the little kindergarten that's right on the Makerere campus.
Oh, wow.
So that I have some linkages also with
And you're the
Uganda.
current president of ASAA.
I am, yes. Well, I keep intermittently losing my cards. I'll try one more time. I'll try one more time to see if I can find it. Yes. Yeah. Usted? So do you have a card as well? So you're based in Miser now? Okay. So, we have some fellowships that we offer every year. Thank you. So Kelly runs the African Studies Center, and we offer fellowships every year for students who are nearing completion to come and spend 4 to 6 months in Michigan and take advantage of resources, get some mentoring if they need it, or work with scholars who might be helpful. So I don't know what your work is on.
My work is on the political governance of the Netherlands.
Wow. So contemporary?
Historical.
Okay. You know Derek, have you met Derek?
I've met Derek,
Yeah, okay.
I'm going to pick up my dad, so.
Okay, yeah, I was gonna say, like, it sounds like you guys connect well. So anyway, have a look at that or contact me and I'll remind you again of the website because we like getting a lot of applicants, especially social science.
Non mi estraghi di... I'm getting to the data collection this year.
Okay.
After that,
Yeah,
I'll
so
be
this is good for the following year, which might be very good timing for you. Yeah. Great. Well, it's good to meet you. I know a lot of people who've been connected to Monster, like Antonio Tomás.
Yes.
Yeah, they really seem to enjoy the experience. And he had a lot of students. Now you see African Association, or African Center for Cities.
Eu te mando um par de coisas você me manda.
Yeah, there's a piece of room on the side downstairs. But just maybe go to the coordinate. There's a piece of room there, so maybe the coordination.
Hello.
Perfekt.
Ja, weil ich selber bin dann auch ist ganz schnell. Oder?
Voll strong.
Gut.
Good morning, everybody. Is it on? Kind of, no? Good.
Oh, da ist niemand.
Aber vorher ging es eigentlich mal. Oder? Jetzt? Und jetzt läuft es. 1, 2, 3. Ja, genau. Ja. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this last keynote of AEGIS 2017. Before we start, I would like to ask you to kind of move a little bit to the center of your row, because there's much space, and if people still coming in, it will be difficult for them to find a seat. So if there's space left and right of you, just concentrate a little bit towards the middle of your row. So this was a first technical thing. A second technical issue. Tonight we have our conference dinner. It starts at 8 p.m. at the Volkshaus, which is on the other side of the Rhine. So you walk down Petersgraben around the corner, and then you come to the bridge head, and you will see the bridge which is under full construction. So you cross the bridge and then take the third road to the right, which is Rheingasse. No, not Rheingasse, Rebgasse, sorry. And there, it's just on your right, is the Volkshaus. Please be there in time at 8. There will be music from 8 to 8:30 and drinks, and then we start with the buffet. Your banquet ticket covers 2 hours of consumption, so you have an interest of being there early. At 10 p.m. we will open the doors, which means other people can also come in, and then a bar opens on the first floor. There will be a party If you don't like the party, but rather prefer live music, then you can go to the Jazz Campus, which is just next door on Utengasse 15. It's really, literally just around the corner. Last but not least, if you want to join the conference dinner and don't have a ticket yet, please come to the conference office. We have the contact details of a few people who still have tickets that they can give away, and it would be very nice if we really filled up the venue tonight. Okay, that's all what I wanted to say here. I hand over to Professor Sophie Oldfield, who will introduce our keynote speaker.
Good morning. My name is Sophie Oldfield. I'm a professor of urban studies at University of Cape Town and University of Basel. So it feels very appropriate and also a great pleasure to introduce my colleague Edgar Pieterse and to welcome him to give his keynote talk on the politics of governing African spaces. Edgar is holder of the South African Research Chair in Urban Policy. He founded and directs the African Centre for Cities, which is just celebrating its 10th anniversary this year. He is a professor in the School of Architecture, Planning and Geomatics at the University of Cape Town. All of those are at UCT. He has done many other things. He has served as a special advisor to the Premier of the Western Cape, our regional provincial government in South Africa, and before that he directed and created a number of urban policy think tanks. His research and teaching gravitates around urban development politics, everyday culture, publics, radical social economies, responsive design, and adaptive governance systems. In these various areas, he's published extensively. He's consulting editor for Cityscapes, which is an international biannual magazine on urbanisms in the Global South. Edgar is also co-author of many books, but I'm going to highlight a few. He is co-author with, he's an author, and he's a co-author with Abdul Malik Simon of a book that's coming out in September called New Urban Worlds, Inhabiting Dissonant Times. He's also author of a series of other books that have come out recently, The African Cities Reader 3, Land, Property and Value in 2015, Africa's Urban Revolution in 2014, and Rogue Urbanism, Emergent African Cities in 2013. He serves on the advisory boards of the Indian Institute for Human Settlements in Bangalore, on the advisory board of LSE Cities in London, the Gauteng City Region Observatory in Johannesburg, the Open Society Foundation of South Africa, among many others. He's a member of the jury of the inaugural Africa Architecture Awards in 2017. I'm going to add a few more, and I'll tell you in a second why I'm doing that. He co-led with Professor Saskia Sassen the urban chapter of the forthcoming report of the International Panel on Social Progress. And he is also a writer, and he sometimes describes himself, and I think it's very appropriate, as a creative agent, engaging in and curating public debates and policy discourses, interventions to make the African city more just, open, and accessible. So I share these little slivers of his work and his passion to give you a glimpse of this extraordinary mix of scholarship, of public intellectual work, of engaging policy and politics across multiple publics. And it's this mix together which helps him think and act in the city. He is an inspiring colleague. He challenges us to steep ourselves in the urban canon, north and south, and many things between. And he challenges us to steep ourselves in the city, and to do so generously, creatively, and rigorously. And in the interest of time, and to give him the chance to really share what he has to share with us, I'm going to hand over now and say it's really a pleasure to introduce and to welcome him to take over the podium. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie, for really generous work. And just for the record, I have nothing to do with performance reviews or bonuses or anything like that, thankfully. So it is an enormous honor and really a profound pleasure, even if it is an intimidating one, to have been asked to contribute to the last keynote address for this conference. The last ECAS conference I attended was in Leipzig, and I don't remember how long ago that was. All I remember is I fell incredibly ill, and I was next to a toilet bowl for 3 days. So I have no idea whether this had anything to do with Leipzig or whether it was just my transition to Berlin, where I spent a few days afterwards. So it is a relief that it's day 4, and I'm still standing, and I'm fine, and hopefully will remain so as I leave the conference after today. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me, and in particular, I want to acknowledge the University of Basel that has reached out to ACC and the University of Cape Town in the last few years so that we could embark on this incredible journey to have a joint program that would develop new teaching programs, but also research explorations. And it just seems really fitting and appropriate that I'm here, finally, for the first time, and that I can contribute some of my recent work and thoughts on the topic of today. I also want to just thank the Heinrich Böll Foundation that made it possible for me to be here, and I participated in a roundtable that they organized earlier in the week. So this keynote will be in a very different register to what we've heard, the last two that we've heard, those incredibly beautiful and evocative keynotes that was presented by my colleagues. And mainly because instead of focusing on the intimacies of discourse, of thought, of ideas, of possibility, and the harsh, cruel realities of everyday life for street children, I'm going to speak about a very different scale. I'm also going to speak about fairly elusive things called policy discourses. And this is really rooted in work that I've been doing the last few years, so it's wonderful to have an opportunity to step back and reflect on what has been an incredibly intense and heady period. So this talk is anchored in by urban policy advocacy, or what one could maybe call advisory work that I did over the last 3 years in the run-up to the 20-year convening by United Nations on Cities, Habitat 3. My plan is to use this time to reflect on why formal discursive shifts at the global and African levels about the territorial underpinnings of sustainable development offers new opportunities to both imagine and instantiate a fresh politics on how urban areas are governed. At the global level, I contributed to the technical research process of UN Habitat to formulate an overarching narrative about the state of the world's cities with an eye on proposing comprehensive reforms to effect structural change. More specifically, I worked on Chapter 6 of the World Cities Report of 2016 that deals with governance. Another global report in 2016 was the Gold 4 report put out by United Cities and Local Government. I collaborated with 2 colleagues to draft the synthesis and recommendations of this report that explored the implications of the 2030 Development Agenda for different categories of territorial organization: metropolitan areas, intermediary cities, regions, small towns, and rural areas. At the African level, I again collaborated with colleagues at ACC to craft a discussion document on what an African perspective might be on a new urban agenda for the world as governments were preparing for Habitat 3. This work was published in 2015 with a view that it would be an informant for country and regional policy processes to clarify the African perspective for Habitat 3. Questions of governance, institutional design, and politics were central to this paper that was published under the auspices of UN Habitat and UNECA. A second Pan-African intervention took the form of the background research paper drafted for the OECD and the African Development Bank as they were putting together the Africa Economic Outlook 2016, which was themed Sustainable Cities and Structural Transformation. The 2 African-focused policy papers had to confront the articulation of African specificities with emerging global discourses generated by the SDGs and the Paris Accord on climate change. This means addressing what academic commentators detail about systemic dysfunctionality and the routine violation of rights and obligations. Moving on, along with this global and African work, I was deeply involved in a national policy drafting process in South Africa to formulate the integrated urban development framework. a forerunner of national urban policies as sanctioned by the new urban agenda adopted at Habitat 3 last year. This gave me an opportunity to work through the discursive gymnastics required to articulate highly localized demands, histories, and institutional imperatives with African and global discourses about urban governance, regulation, and politics. Lastly, and before I'm accused of being the bag man for what academics call free-floating or traveling discourses, I need to mention that during this time, I was also working intimately with a social movement called the Social Justice Coalition, operative around safety and sanitation issues in areas of Khayelitsha, one of the largest suburbs of Cape Town. Strictly speaking, this was not conventional research, but rather a process of mutual socialization and extraction. I hung out on a periodic basis with a cross-section of the leadership of SJC to creatively explore dilemmas of strategy and tactics, drawing on social history methods in a focus group setting. In return, I offered my experience and knowledge of comparable social movement practices in other urban settings of the world, as well as earlier periods of social struggle in Cape Town. These intimate conversations were profoundly important as an anchoring device as I was plying my policy craft at these other scales of politics. One of the insights that me over the course of this work was the ways in which the political policy ground on questions of urbanization in sub-Saharan Africa had shifted compared to just a few years before. In 2014, Sue Parnell and I published the edited volume, Africa's Urban Revolution, and many chapters in that volume confirmed the long-standing lament about anti-urban bias practiced by most African governments, manifest in mired devolution efforts combined with futile anti-migration policies. However, to my surprise, it is clear that in just the last 5 years or so, there has been a sea change at various levels of formal governance across the continent. Most significantly, at the Pan-African level, the African Union, UNECA, and the African Development Bank have all been driving a much more aggressive line around the imperatives to rethink, remake, and reinvest multi-level governance arrangements to improve the prospects of what is now called structural economic transformation and inclusive growth. Sorry, I'm going to work through quite a bit of water. Embedded in this new policy discourse, This can be a fantastic farcical keynote where I just, sort of test out what is sayable on the verbatim screen. Did that appear? No. Okay. Embedded in this new policy discourse is an unmistakable recognition that unless a stronger territorial or spatial understanding begins to drive routine processes of infrastructure investment and economic development, most African countries will remain low income and marginal in global value chains. Furthermore, it is recognized that the imperative to coordinate, sequence, and calibrate disparate investments in highly complex and volatile systems require a territorial proximity that the traditional model of national-centric planning and management is just not well suited for. In the next section, I will trace some of the emblematic milestones in this policy reorientation, but with an eye on what it might mean for the imperative to rethink and remake multi-level governance arrangements animated by new policy imperatives such as infrastructure-led growth, closely linked to the macroeconomic imperative to achieve structural transformation. These imperatives are forging and foregrounding a more explicit spatial articulation of macroeconomic policy, which in turn instigates significant institutional reforms that announce, I believe, novel political opportunities for deep democracy and cultural citizenship. The second half of the paper will set out a potential methodological register in the broader sense of that term on how we could possibly track, analyze, and engage these processes at the urban scale in order to arrive at a propositional sensibility about governing diverse spaces. So, major discursive shifts that is worth noting are the following. Of course, at the core of this is the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, as embodied in the 17 SDGs, and this reflects the culmination, I would argue, of at least 2 decades of sustained human rights struggles to push back on the narrow economistic precepts of neoliberal managerialism. For example, there's now an explicit recognition that growing intra- and inter-country inequality is a major impediment to inclusivity. This is a profound break with the reformist poverty reduction orientation of the MDGs of 2000. The SDGs also acknowledge the environmental limits of the dominant growth model that remains the de facto reference point for governments and companies. Thus, there's now a strong push to mainstream the work and perspective of UNEP, amongst others, on sustainable production and consumption, linked to a separate set of goals on changing the carbon intensity and, very importantly, resource intensity, as in materials, that underpin consumption patterns. So, in other words, in the SDGs, we witness a mainstreaming of the long-standing political claims and policy proposals to internalize negative environmental and social costs, opening up a line of politics to build a broad-based front against extractive and exploitative capitalist processes. It is precisely these ambitions that have reinforced a more popular discourse and imagination about post-capitalist futures and trajectories, as we've, for example, seen in the recent work of Mason. Lastly, the SDGs also recognize the importance of sustainable urbanization as a precondition for a more green and inclusive economic patterning of development. This is a major departure, again, from the aspatial and implicitly anti-urban orientation of the MDGs. And it has created room for a pointed argument that the SDGs must be localized, i.e., driven from the grassroots by municipalities and citizens' movements if they are likely to find resonance and sustain traction in diverse contexts. A number of broader dynamics made it possible for the SDGs to break with the welfarist reformism of the MDGs. One, the damaging environmental impacts of existing economic globalization process have been argued convincingly through the climate change evidence and its calculation-driven discourse, creating an opening for the broader sustainable development perspective of Yonder to stage a comeback after being unable to substantially shift economist reference points of international and national developmentalism. Two, the exclusionary and alienating aspects of neoliberal globalism was made evident through the lingering effects of youth unemployment and political volatility across many OECD countries, especially Southern Europe, linked to the decentralized impacts of terrorist violence linked to the so-called alienated youth. Into this disjuncture step populist ideologues on both the left and the right, unsettling traditional centrist parties and coalitions across the OECD world, but also deeply entrenched political parties that have been in power since independence in many African countries. The post-2008 era spelled political uncertainty, volatility, and changing public attitudes towards incumbent political parties, undermining the hegemony of economic globalists and the political parties who grew fat off those ideological regimes. These broader trends played out in interesting ways in much of sub-Saharan Africa. The boosterism narrative of it being Africa's economic time that took hold and flourished post-2000 was starting to experience strain. GDP growth rates started to slow and stagnate in some places, no least South Africa, and substantial investment gaps remained. Across the development and private sector think tanks, two structural breaks on sustained and high economic growth were identified. One, limited and inefficient infrastructure, and two, weak governance and regulatory practice that constitute systemic risk for large-scale investment. Of course, these two dynamics are inextricably linked. It is against this backdrop that I want to turn to the announcement and promotion of Agenda 2063, the signature political program and ideological frame of the African Union. Initiated in 2013 in Addis Ababa on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the Organization of African Unity. The 50th milestone informed the 50-year horizon of the revitalized Pan-African vision as reflected in the designator Agenda 2063. In keeping with the nature of these aspirational and norm-setting policy frameworks, Agenda 2063 envisages a profoundly transformed continent, people, and economy, expressed through the vision of, and I quote, an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa driven by its own citizens and representing a dynamic force in the international arena, end quote. The vision is meant to be realized through a highly focused, strongly normative, and popular agenda that is cognizant of the importance of mobilization of the people and the ownership of continental programs at the core. The principle of self-reliance in African financing its own development, the importance of capable, inclusive, and accountable states and institutions at all levels and in all spheres, and the critical role of regional economic communities as building blocks of continental unity. So much so that, as you can see, popular artists like Black Coffee has decided he can give his own version of the African rising narrative. This assertion hints at the seductive yearning for a uniquely African social solidarity, rooted in long-standing, imagined, cultural values and practice that have endured despite the horrors of colonialism and ready to be mobilized for a modernized version of what Africa was always meant to be. And again, I quote, united to realize its renaissance, end quote. It would be the easiest thing in the world to shoot holes in the kitsch fabric of this obvious fiction, but that would be to miss the point about the importance of animating narratives that creates a semblance of a shared footing in order to have a certain kind of political conversation that may or may not lead to coordinated action across profound difference and disagreements. However, I will return to the notion of shared narratives and the work they do in the fabrication of political and public spaces. Notably, though, Agenda 2063 is certainly a product of its time. At least since the MDGs, there has been this unmistakable adoption of performance management rhetoric and planning across most development frameworks and agreements. For example, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development has 17 goals and 169 targets that all states will be measured against on an annual basis in anticipation of what might be achieved by 2030. Similarly, 2063 must be read alongside the first 10-year implementation plan, 2014 to 2023, published by the African Union. This 140-page compendium of goals, targets, indicators, and all of the accompanying measures set out in meticulous detail, even if some of them are wildly optimistic. For they all speak to how what is at the core of Agenda 2063, the 7 aspirations, will be achieved. Now, again, this is not the occasion to delve into the function of these kinds of policy artifacts, but it is important to recognize the existence and how they might provide a staging ground for a nuanced politics of critique, collaboration, learning, experimentation, and forging novel coalitions across sectors and scales. These policy artifacts are not meant to be taken literal. They are discursive mechanisms aimed at instilling confidence and purpose in a sea of uncertainty and uncontrollable factors that will scupper the most well-laid plans. One of the most important impacts of Agenda 2063 is that it has made a clearing for a more grounded and politically astute macroeconomic policy discussion under the sign of the concept structural transformation. Now, this concept represents an attempt by African economists to confront the deep-seated legacies of colonial exploitation and the ways in which this laid the tracks for the asymmetrical incorporation of African economies into globalization. It then follows that extraordinary policy focus and discipline is required to deploy macroeconomic and fiscal levers of the state to escape historical traps of dependency in favor of a more dynamic and inclusive trajectory. However, this cannot be done without leveraging the collective power of supranational regions in Africa and ultimately the African continent as a single economic organism, characterized by, and again I quote from the Agenda 2063 document, and I think this is absolutely profound, free movement of people, goods, capital, and services to increase trade and investment amongst African countries. So Agenda 2063 does nothing, if Agenda 2063 does nothing else but give impetus to a single economic and labor market for Africa, it can be regarded, I would argue, as a success. Furthermore, structural transformation is linked to a more explicit consideration of space and territoriality in meeting the lofty aspirations of the African Union and its member states. The rapidly growing body of work of UNECA has been the most significant body of development thought to substantiate the political, policy, and regulatory implications of these lofty ideals. UNECA has produced a series of reports on various dimensions of structural transformation over the last few years, ranging from analysis of trade policy to the exploration of why an explicit green economic approach is the most promising for realizing the ideals of structural transformation, to the most recent focus on the connections between urbanization and structural transformation. It is the last report that I draw on to illustrate the policy narrative that UNECA is driving, which is achieving significant traction with key infrastructure financing institutions such as the ADB, the World Bank, various Chinese banks, and the DBSA in Southern Africa. But first, a few words on the policy meaning of structural transformation. As its core, of course, It denotes processes to shift labor out of low productivity agriculture into high productivity manufacturing and modern services. Across most of sub-Saharan Africa, it is not occurring fast enough. And in many countries, we see evidence that there's almost an unchanged economic structures during the post-colonial period. Thus, the relative shares of agriculture, industry, and services have remained more or less the same, except for manufacturing as a component of industry, which has actually declined since 1960 in relative terms. These patterns persist despite a dramatic expansion of the labor force and educational improvements, especially over the last 2 decades. Large-scale, labor-intensive, and productive industrialization is not on the cards for most African economies, leaving them marginal and vulnerable in an increasingly integrated global economy, and most importantly, unable to absorb new entrants into the labor market, into the formal labor market, I should say. Given the youthful demographic of sub-Saharan Africa and the persistence of high fertility rates, this is a recipe for economic and political ruin, especially as young people are more prone to participate in oppositional protests and disruption, dynamics that are seemingly exacerbated by the proliferation of mobile digital technologies. This speaks to the centrality of the structural transformation discourse across Pan-African political development and financing institutions. It is also a discourse that can enroll and animate the private sector and civic groups keen on fostering a politics of inclusion and voice, especially for youth. It even resonates with proponents of the informal economy because these practices are seen as evidence of the lack of structural transformation and therefore ideal agents to be supported to deepen industrialization and productivity. However, the dimension of the UNECA outlook that I am most struck by is the recent embracing of a spatial and territorial perspective in thinking through the governance preconditions for reorienting macroeconomic and infrastructure policies to derail low industrial path-dependent the low industrial path-dependent track that most African countries find themselves on. Early in 2017, the UNECA launched their flagship report, Urbanization and Industrialization. And it is refreshing in its candor when it unpacks the connections between African urbanization and economic performance. African cities thus face low productivity, tepid job growth, high informality, huge infrastructure and service gaps, weak linkages with rural areas, high levels of informality, increasing inequalities, growing environmental damage, and vulnerability to climate change and weak institutional systems and capacities. Unless resolved, these impediments will undermine Africa's urban potential for structural transformation. The challenge confronting Africa is thus to accelerate structural transformation by harnessing the rapid urban transition to promote economic diversification with a special focus on industrialization that will create jobs, enhance access to basic services, and reduce inequality and poverty. The second part of this position is based on an assumption that as urbanization intensifies, the growing population represents crucial potential markets for goods, services, and especially infrastructure systems that will have to conduct the generation and circulation of economic value. Thus, for UNECA, the key to structural transformation lies in territorial and infrastructure because global value chains have particular geographies, and there is policy scope to rethink and re-engineer these geographies through thoughtful and anticipatory infrastructure planning to foster a dynamic, interdependent, and differentiated national and subnational system of regional economies. In their previous report, UNECA goes even further and argues that not only can territorial infrastructure planning disrupt uneven development and urban primacy, but it can also catalyze a simultaneous transition to a green economy in terms of the underlying technologies that will shape energy, mobility, water, and ICT. However, the Urbanization and Industrialization report goes further than infrastructure and foregrounds the problematic urban form, as in spatial structure, of many African cities, which not only reinforces social segregation, but also represents a substantial cost for urban livelihoods and businesses. However, the report not only argues for refined macroeconomic policy, but also for drastic intergovernmental institutional reconfiguration so that local actors that are most knowledgeable about local conditions can do the frontline work of detailed industrial and spatial policy design. effectively providing a renewed argument for substantive devolution of powers, functions, and financial authority. This is important because evidence from many sub-Saharan African countries demonstrate that devolution reforms have essentially become stuck for at least the last 2 decades, with cases of re-centralization when opposition political parties were able to get a foothold in municipal governance. The UNECA can be this bullish in their policy arguments because of important shifts that have taken place at the African Union level. In order to prepare for an African regional perspective on a new urban agenda that would be adopted at Habitat 3 in 2016, the African Union established a new political subcommittee on, and this is a mouthful, Urban Development and Human Settlements of the African Union Specialized Technical Committee on Public Service, Local Government, Urban Development, and Decentralization. I'd like to see how that works on a card. This technical committee was itself a novel structure when it was first convened in 2014. The work of the subcommittee culminated in the adoption of the Common African Position on the Third United Nations Conference on Human Housing and Sustainable Urban Development, and this was adopted in February 2016. The Common Position sets out a number of positions that sets the stage for the Africa Economic Outlook of 2016 and UNECA's interventions that I've just discussed. This overlapping and mutually reinforcing macro policy frameworks are indeed unprecedented and represents, if read carefully, a radically different institutional and political landscape for future governance dynamics as territorial considerations become interlinked with macroeconomic decisions and infrastructure investment regimes. In the second half of the paper, I want to delineate what this political landscape contains, in order to make a speculative argument for translational research that can document, critique, and extend multiscalar politics. So now I want to turn to how we can potentially recast the nature of urban governance in the context of these broader shifts. So in the wake of the SDGs, the Paris Climate Accord, and the New Urban Agenda, the formal policy reference points of an ideal multi-level governance approach have shifted. It is now recognized that multi-level institutional configurations must be defined in relation to a macroeconomic policy ideal that seeks to accelerate industrialization based on a locally defined set of economic strategies that seek to intervene in value chains of key economic sectors that depend on expanding urban populations. It is further accepted that infrastructure investments required to optimize industrialization and urban efficiencies should be made and coordinated by local actors that understand the microdynamics of their territorial economies that should ideally anchor diversification. It is further asserted that these infrastructure investments should not only drive industrialization, but also create a platform for a transition to a low-carbon and resource-efficient economic structure that optimizes labor absorption. These are significant discursive shifts, but it raises daunting questions about how one can change the predominant dynamics and cultures of pre-existing governance dynamics. 3 weighty problems present themselves. First, most African countries and cities are marked by infrastructural and spatial path dependency dynamics that are notoriously difficult to change. In other words, their regimes of infrastructure technology design, operations, and management are crystallized around deeply entrenched set of vested interests. Since infrastructure investments have long lead times, what is currently on the books will remain a dominant structuring force for at least the next decade. Second, technical path dependence is reinforced by an even more pernicious dynamic, institutional inertia. There's a large scholarship on the dysfunctional nature of the public sector bureaucracies in many African countries. Typically, the public sector remained cast in the mold of colonial administrations, especially in terms of hierarchical power relations embedded in command and control decision-making, a system that proved useful to entrench a new post-colonial administrative elite that was intimately entwined with the political party machines that overdetermined the economy, politics, and administrative functioning. These dynamics were further entrenched and perverted when new public administration tools around privatization, corporatization, partnerships, and performance management were overlaid in an instrumentalized fashion since the 1990s. Instead of promoting greater responsiveness to the needs and demands of citizens, bureaucratic power became more intensified and opaque, but draped in a language of accountability and performance, fueling deep-seated mistrust and public cynicism. Rents that politically connected actors are able to extract rely on this institutional dysfunction to continue. Third, in most African contexts, dominant ruling political parties overdetermine every aspect of public priority setting and resource allocation. This is such a pervasive fact of life that most actors and citizens simply take it as a given, and this power is derived from keeping the system as it is. The culturally specific manifestation of these dynamics need to be made legible through careful research and analysis. On this occasion, I want to propose 3 conceptual entry points for this work. 1, narrative, 2, ritual, and 3, deal-making. The narrative dimension of governance refers to where dominant circulating discourse are deployed to fashion and reproduce the necessary fictions of rule. These are large, muscular, and often masculine normative frames, such as patriotism, empowerment, Pan-Africanism, even Ubuntu. These narratives stabilize nation building and forge the basis of legitimacy and authority of ruling elites. Importantly, such narratives feed off and blend in with popular cultural currents that aggregate the meaning of citizenship and political attachment. It is unhelpful to dismiss popular cultural beliefs and practice of this order as false consciousness or deceit. These narratives endure and reinvent themselves because they function in highly subtle and resonant ways as public affects. They are best dislodged and problematized through competing narratives that have a stronger affective pull. The ritual dimension denotes the embodied institutional scripts that flow from these narrative frames and allow for a certain kind of translation into administrative practice and effects. It is in rituals that the performative dimension of politics comes to the fore. In a context of relatively limited resources due to small tax bases and highly truncated systems of patronage, rituals are even more exaggerated and achieve a life force and dynamism of their own. Generally, political party cultures, hierarchies, decision-making systems, and informal networks shape these, but always interwoven with formal, deliberative governmental procedures in both the legislature and the executive and administrative components of the state. Arguably, party-dominated bureaucracies take their cue from these ritualized practices to establish a set of administrative systems and practices that quickly manifest in unique rituals that must be mastered if one is to get anything done when able. These rituals can vary widely, ranging from militarist efficiency to extravagantly baroque. It is not possible to move economic or political agendas forward without understanding and engaging with these performative dimensions of statehood. Furthermore, non-state cultural reference points, whether it's religious affiliations, are vital to the maintenance and reproduction of these rituals. Lastly, deal-making. One down. Deal-making is another dimension to the unraveling and remaking of multi-level governance. The understanding of framing narratives and the ritual of performative politics are helpful to decipher the profound gap between formal state rhetoric and practice, and how such practice relate back to party dynamics and elite functioning. However, they are always intertwined with a profound pragmatism to cut deals in order to navigate opaque rules of the game and keep resources flowing. Deal-making happens behind the translucent screens of narrative and ritual. In other words, if actors who want to advance an alternative, more progressive politics fail to read the prevailing narratives and their functioning, along with the rituals of public administration, they will simply not be effective in shaping narratives or destabilizing practices that reproduce the status quo. This brings the talk to my penultimate thematic, and that is what kind of politics can be imagined and institutionalized to ensure that the progressive normative ambitions of Agenda 2063 and the trope of green structural transformation can in fact be achieved, or at least be something that comes into a realistic horizon. So I want to explore now the potential power in infrastructural politics. The most potent politics aggregates around infrastructure. Since infrastructure deficits and malfunctioning constitutes the largest brake on sustained economic growth and accumulation, it attracts an inordinate amount of political and technical attention, no least from international actors on the financing side of the development industry. The downstream effects of infrastructure malfunction are also most likely to trigger social dissent and protest, and in this sense, it always carries a political charge. The planning and financing of infrastructure falls to the most powerful centers of power within the state, and that is ministries of finance, economic development, infrastructure, and typically the presidency. These actors are also the primary targets of Pan-African norm-setting forums and national commitments, which does create leverage in terms of holding them accountable and advocating at a narrative level around adopted and professed norms. For example, the assertions and commitments embedded in the Africa Common Position that I mentioned earlier is highly consistent with the recommendations of UNECA's work discussed before. Since the senior ministers in the state are involved and a number of bold and clear policy propositions have been accepted, it is conceivable, at least in theory, that a radical transformative platform can be constructed to shift the trajectory of a country or the city. Significantly, infrastructure systems also reveal most clearly the coexistence of formal and informal systems of social and economic reproduction. For example, given the low levels of baseload energy infrastructure, the majority of African households are responsible for their own micro-infrastructure solutions. This is typically expensive and inefficient, but energy-poor households find a way. Similar scenarios pertain to water access, sanitation, and transport, even housing. And so it is really, and so on. A rich and helpful academic research agenda has sprung up, of course, to make legible and understand these hybrid socio-technical systems that underpin the functioning of African cities and communities. In the case of energy, most urban households who live in slum conditions rely on biomass that is not particularly efficient and often detrimental to environmental health terms. Similarly, most of the public transport infrastructure, minibus taxis, are privately operate in a gray zone of semi-formality. Likewise, neighborhood-based social enterprises and cooperatives organize waste management and sanitation disposal. The point is that any future evolution of these systems must engage with the de facto hybrid functioning of these machines and allow for a contextually defined transition to a more effective, integrated, and formal system that might emerge over time, with an acceptance that multiple systems with different rhythms and institutional forms will have to coexist for the considerable future. It is indeed these system adaptations that can undergird, I would argue, the green economy as envisaged in what I've discussed earlier. Notably, the expansion of infrastructure, investment, and concomitant planning of future systems that are more inclusive and adaptive will require a change to multi-level governance systems. It is in this imperative that the strongest potential for a transformative politics lie. And you might ask why. In my view, infrastructure priorities defined in terms of the imperatives of access, green economic transitions, and basic urban efficiency demand a more coordinated, sequenced, and integrated approach to infrastructure planning, investment, delivery, and maintenance and repair. And since any infrastructure response will have to acknowledge and incorporate de facto systems of functioning, it will also require careful and sustained engagement with informal providers and intermediaries. The imperatives of coordination and cooperation demand a localized institutional framework for infrastructure planning and management, especially as the complexity of variegated demands in major urban hubs intensify and international investors demand localized institutional capacity and accountability. These exogenous factors conspire to create, I would argue, a novel set of political openings and opportunities for progressive urban actors wishing to animate new terms of engagement and urban incorporation. However, this implies a savvy and nimble political sensibility and capacity. So in the next section of the paper that I won't read, because it sort of gets into a very particular literature on how to think about power and political settlements, I'll just very briefly summarize the argument and then I'll conclude with the last part of the paper. So this section of the paper is titled Triangulating Dimensions of Governance, Forms of Power and Political Settlement. And what I try and do is take the framework that I suggested earlier of narrative, ritual and deal-making and argue for a triangulation with a second framework suggested by John Gaventa and Petit, which argues that there are three kinds of power that can be read in any kind of local context: visible power, hidden power, and invisible power. Visible power is obviously the sort of self-evident manifestation of power in the form of formal systems of governance and so forth. And hidden power refers to the de facto practice of agreements that are struck to kind of fuel and animate the machine. Hidden power depends on invisible power, which references the sort of sociological work of Frey and Biko and so forth about internalized systems of subjectivity, whereby the subaltern think of themselves in a subaltern position. And then the last framework comes from this more recent, and a lot of people in this room will know a lot more about this than I, about this idea of political settlement, and particularly Kelsel's work, where he tries to differentiate between three dimensions of thinking through political settlement, right? The term of elite inclusion or exclusion, the basis of elite inclusion, exclusion, whether it is on the basis of sharing the spoils, or the idea that there should be effective elite coordination to achieve higher order goals, such as nationalism or whatever the case might be. And the third axis to this cubic framework is the idea of bureaucratic competence, right? So whether it's impersonal, emulating a Weberian aspiration, or whether it is highly captured in terms of personal coordination. So this is quite a useful way to build a fairly crude understanding of what some of the dynamics are. So to sort of summarize this argument, it's maybe useful to capture it in this way. There's a significant deepening of Pan-African developmentalist discourse that connect macro outcomes such as inclusive growth and environmental sustainability with a stronger territorial imagination about how states need to restructure their internal multi-level systems to become more effective, popular, and inclusive. This can and should be seized by progressive actors and scholars who wish to instantiate a more radical, democratic, and inclusive urban politics. However, to be effective in this regard, it is important to deploy research and analysis to build a much more rounded and fine-grained account of the status quo and why it remains stubbornly impervious to waves of reform. Such a research effort demands a more sober and direct account of the political opportunity structure to progressively instantiate these emerging discourses. In this section of the paper, I've suggested that triangulation of three analytical prisms might help us in this regard. The crude accounting that this last framework on political settlement offers might be a step that can help yield, that can help us to start this process, but it needs to be nuanced by isolating the ways in which overarching narratives of nationhood and state building creates a series of rationalities for very specific rituals of state performance, which in turn provides a canopy for a wide range of grounded micro-practices of deal-making within which ordinary people and their various intermediating social networks are always hard at work to capitalize on deals or renegotiate them. However, to establish a truly grounded reading of the cultural terms of these processes, it is necessary to overlay the analysis with an account of how visible, hidden, and invisible power dynamics work in practice. This requires fine-grained and possibly embedded research to account for the practices, rationalities, and dynamics of public institutions charged with interpreting and enacting broader normative visions. In the last section of the paper, then, as a form of a conclusion, I want to make a sustained social science, I want to make a case for a sustained social science research approach to populate this triangulation imperatives with sound data and analysis. However, this is not enough. We need to think of the role of research as integral to the large imperatives of fostering new institutional systems of governance, management, and rule that strengthens national imperatives to discharge coordination and alignment. At the same time, we need to recognize that alternative local governance and policy process cannot emerge unless they are connected to pointed experiments to embark on novel ways of planning, structuring, investing in, and running sustainable infrastructures that contribute directly to empowerment and social spatial inclusion. Now, I know it will be frustrating to you, so I'm going to not elaborate on the last two slides. I'm going to very briefly walk you through what I have in mind here, but I think this will be the focus of a follow-up paper, a more expansive elaboration. But I want to denote this as an experimental research milieu that entails sort of a deliberative set of attempts to begin to get at the grounded, highly localized obstacles to getting traction for some of them. So my entry point is the fundamental task of academic research, critical thought, which conventionally is the interplay between established theoretical assumptions, a research question which leads to a research strategy, and an eventual reporting on the outcomes of the research. Fundamentally, the work is driven by a desire to figure out what should be done to solve and engage the problem at the core of the research question. However, instead of adopting a muscular explanatory theories that have fixed structural determinants of the problem, this approach is more interested in foregrounding the range of possible actions with an eye on what might work in the entangled messiness of the real city. Actions are tabulated in two columns: probable future directions versus possible future directions. Probability is what critical social scientists are very well trained in. We can offer long lists of why the status quo is likely to remain stubbornly in place, and the more our outlooks are shaped by structural ontologies, the more we are trapped by probable horizons. In contrast, actions in the possible futures column are willing to take a couple of leaps of faith. Believers as they are in the potential of surprise, contingency, and new conjunctures that trigger unexpected cultural effects. Those who struggle to leave the land of the probable tend to conclude that the only worthy next step is confrontational political action, which in turn, of course, requires further theoretical fuel to keep the critical thought project alive. Now, the romantics, on the other hand, where I obviously locate myself, for lack of a better term, are keen to enter experimental labs, sites, milieus with a diversity of practitioners invested in the issue at the core of the research question. This cohort is fated to learn how to conduct translational research, a practice of intermediating between different knowledge registers in order to move between science and experience, codified knowledge and tacit understanding, abstracted ideas and experientially based insights, and so on. However, to achieve genuinely novel and surprising insights, these different registers need to be animated by various learning techniques that are able to surface and articulate both reasoned and affective rationalities. If done well, if curated with care, if underpinned with rigorous scholarship and a commitment to social justice, these experimental labs can produce genuine innovation in how to understand specific problems and or new ways of tackling it. At all times in these experimental milieus, the goal is to figure out how to institutionalize novel approaches that can have material effects that will, over time and through learning, impact on larger numbers of people. The core drive of experimental milieus is to figure out what has a chance to succeed, how the innovation can be scaled and sustained through the routine functioning of democratic institutions. Of course, in some cases, the experiments may be too modest or narrow to translate into institutional propositions. In these instances, the search moves to theorization, raising new questions that can challenge and stretch the theoretical accounts of what might work or not in a given situation. Both the practice of institutionalization across differences and theoretical spade work contribute ultimately to deep learning, which has to be embedded in the cultural aspirations of social and knowledge actors invested in figuring out an urban politics that excites, animates, and instigates transformational political acts. So in conclusion, a core argument of this paper is that we are in the midst of a number of important policy discursive shifts that will trigger the establishment of new urban governance mechanisms and processes. It is important to pay attention to these processes and not assume a priori that it is simply more of the same. Instead, we need to offer a critical perspective on why these institutional proposals are not simply about technocratic competence, but rather a different kind of politics that need researchers to identify and analyze the ways in which vested interests and hidden dynamics of power operate to frustrate infrastructural modernization and democratization. Thus, this is not an argument for only conducting research linked to institutional experimentation that must supplant conventional scholarship. On the contrary, we need a lot more interdisciplinary analysis of political institutions, life worlds and cultures across visible and hidden dimensions of politics that shape urban life and opportunity. This is especially important at a time that investments are increasing with profound spatial effects. However, I do think that the established research approaches and theoretical frameworks can be enriched and expanded if there's more articulation with localized practice of speculative research. In my reading, both are essential to make sense of the new kinds of cultural, political, institutional configurations that are emerging to substantiate new normative commitments and aspirations. By paying attention to the multi-layered nature of these contradictory processes, we might yet have something useful to contribute to a new African urban politics and imagination. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much to Edgar Pieterse, really giving us a sense of scale and practice, a language for thinking about policy and real politics at a continental scale, and a lot of challenges for thinking about knowledge production in that space. So we'd just like to say a final thank you, and I'm going to hand over to Veit.
Thank you very much, Edgar. Thank you very much, Sophie. You might wonder what these things here are. We've got, like, as a token of appreciation for Edgar, we've got some of the jazz he will miss tonight. So there's at least one track with the Blue Notes Tribute Orchestra. We've got not only Swiss chocolates, because that's what many of you carry home, it's Basel chocolates. And these chocolates, they are courtesy of the town of Basel. And in this letter, there's not a bribe to make Edgar come to Basel, but rather it's a letter of welcome by the town of Basel. It's really indeed a long time that we've wanted to engage with each other and for you to come over. I remember in 2009 we met in Cape Town in the run-up to a research application, which in the end didn't work out, but which has driven a lot of our research at both ends. So I'm very glad you are here, and I wish you a safe journey to Cape Town. I would like to thank the Böll Foundation, which sponsored this lecture, and also the Roundtable on the Open City yesterday. And speaking of thanks, I would just like to remind you of the closing plenary. I know the closing plenary of ECOS, there's not much hope that many people will attend, but it will be for us the opportunity to thank all our helping hands we've had during these 3 days. So if ever you can make it, or if you can motivate colleagues to come to this room at 6 to give a clap to the old student helping hands, I would be very glad. Thank you.